time to get into some practical coding examples with promises. In all of the past sections, we've been using JS Playgrounds to execute our code, but JS Playgrounds doesn't really work too well with promises or any type of asynchronous code. So instead, I'm going to transition to using a code editor instead. So I recommend that you pop open whatever code editor you would like, and the process here, kind of the workflow we're going to use, is we're going to write code into our code editor, and then we will copy paste it over to a console inside of Chrome. So I'm going to open up my JavaScript console right here. You can open yours up by just right-clicking anywhere on the screen, click Inspect, and at the very top right here you can click on Console, and boom, there you go. And so right here we can execute any amount of JavaScript that we want. So again, we're going to write code inside of our code editor and then copy paste it over here. And again, that's just because JS Playgrounds doesn't play too nicely with deferred code or deferred execution. Okay, so time to write some code. Goal number one here is to be able to create a promise. That's the first thing we want to do. I just want to create a promise. Now before we do that, I just want to throw a quick snippet out there about promises. The vast majority of use of promises that you ever see is working with AJAX requests. And certainly in the context of everything I've told you about promises so far, I've been talking about AJAX requests, HTTP requests, like network requests, again and again and again. But promises are an entire subject that is not necessarily super coupled with AJAX requests. So you can make an AJAX request without a promise. You can make a promise without an AJAX request. They go in together hand in hand, like say peanut butter and jelly, but they're not necessarily, like you don't have to use one with the other, or like they're not mutually dependent. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyways, just something to keep in mind. So I want to create a new promise, just empty shell of a promise. How do I do that? We'll put const promise, and then we will assign it a new promise. So this is where discussion about promises as a part of ES6 and specifically about native implementation comes into play. So I have loaded absolutely no library yet, like no third-party library, nothing like that. Promise right here, the keyword is just available inside of my browser. It is a property that exists on the Windows scope of the browser, so no need to load up any library whatsoever as long as my browser supports it. So now we can copy this line right here. I'm going to bring it over to my Chrome console. We can paste it, and well, hot dog, we get a big error. So promise resolver undefined and is not a function. So it looks like, you know what, this thing knows what a promise is. It looks like the way in which I created my promise was not quite up to par. I didn't quite do it the right way. So we just hit an error pretty quickly there. The error message specifically says resolver undefined and is not a function, okay? So there's a couple of little areas around promises where it's really tough for me to do any type of reasonable lead in. So there's a couple areas here where I'm just gonna kind of put code up on the screen and we're just gonna have to talk about what it's doing and why it's doing it, okay? So just keep that in mind. Inside of the promise constructor right here, I'm gonna add in a function. Just like so. That's it. That's all I want to do. And I'm going to copy paste this over again. And I used const here. And as we learned, we cannot redeclare variables with const. So I made a little bit of an oopsie there. I'm going to flip back over to my editor and replace it with let. And you know what? Let's just dump it. I'm just not going to declare or use a keyword at all. I'm going to refresh the page just so that error will go away. And okay, there we go. So back to normal here. Again, because I used const, I could not redeclare the word promise as we learned much earlier inside this course. Okay, so this time around, we get a much more promising, it's a pun right there, result back. So you'll notice that we get some type of object back. It has this promise status property of pending and a promise value of undefined. So this pending value right here, the status, is a reference to the terminology that we used just a moment ago. This promise is now unresolved. It is waiting for something to happen. It is waiting for some result to come in and say, hey, like that long-running process, everything went A-OK and we're good to go now. So it's up to us, whenever we define a promise from scratch, to decide when the promise is resolved or rejected. To resolve or reject a promise, our inner function right here gets called with two arguments. resolve and reject. These are both functions right here. So I can call resolve like so. If I call resolve, it will enter the promise into the resolve state, and if I were to instead call reject, it would turn the promise into the rejected state. Okay, so that's the purpose of resolve and reject. These two arguments right here, just to be really clear, are automatically provided to this inner function. So I'm not defining anything else, just this inner function that I've declared automatically get called with resolve and reject. So let's resolve this promise and see what happens now. So I'm going to copy paste this over. And now you can see that my promise status is resolved because I have resolved the promise. I could just as easily reject the promise. So now I'll reject it instead. I'll copy paste it over. And at first I'm going to clear the console by clicking this icon right here. So let's reject it. And now you can see that the promise is in the rejected state. I also get an error message in this case as well. Something that says, hey, your promise is rejected and you didn't handle that appropriately. So whenever a promise is rejected, if we don't handle it in some fashion, we get an error message saying, hey, you know what? Something went bad with that long-running process and you didn't really do anything about it. You might want to handle that in some fashion. That's what that's saying right there. Okay, so at this point, all we've done is confirmed some of the terminology that we saw in the last section. By default, whenever a promise is created, it has a status unresolved or pending, as we saw. And we can change the promise's status to resolved or rejected by calling either the resolve or reject function. So let's continue the next section now by looking at what exactly those then and catch handlers are doing for us.